After the sentencing, the legal outcome was fixed, but the record was not finished. A guilty plea closes a case in court, but it can leave gaps in the timeline because there is no trial to force every detail into public testimony. Investigators still needed clarity on the sequence of events, the decisions, and the way he constructed the first false story. So, months later, law enforcement went to him where he would live for the rest of his life. On February 18th, 2019, agents from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and a detective from Frederick Police traveled to the Wisconsin prison where Chris Watts was housed. They met him in a large open room staff called the computer room. He did not expect to see them again. They told him they were not there for an open investigation. They told him they wanted to understand what happened fully, and they wanted to address claims about other alleged affairs during his marriage. Chris described his life after conviction in short, controlled terms. He said the Weld County Jail in Colorado was unbearable because other inmates screamed at him from their cells and threatened what they would do if they ever reached him. He said the jail had to lock down entire sections just to move him through hallways. He said Wisconsin was different. He said he could call his father, mother, and sister. He said he received letters from strangers, including hateful letters and letters from people who wanted to attach themselves to his case. Then the interview turned toward the part the public wanted, but the law did not require for sentencing the cleanest version of the story from his own mouth after the plea was already done. In this interview, he admitted a crucial fact about the narrative he first offered in the interrogation room back in August of 2018. He said he had never considered the idea that Shanann killed the children until it was suggested to him during questioning. He said that once it was mentioned, he simply went with it. He said he knew his parents did not like Shanann and might believe she was involved, and he allowed that belief to form around his lie. That admission matters because it shows the shape of his survival instinct. When the lie was breaking, he tried to build a new lie that preserved him as something less than what he was. Then he walked investigators through the final night and morning again with details that made the story even harder to hear. He said Shanann returned home around 2 in the morning. He said he felt her get into bed. He said she seemed unsettled, as if she suspected he was having an affair. He described intimacy that happened after she returned and said it felt strange to him, like a test, like a moment that triggered something inside him. Later, when it was close to leaving for work, he said he got ready and then returned to the bedroom to wake Shanann so they could talk. He described climbing onto the bed and straddling her near the waist while they spoke. He described Shanann crying and saying she knew there was someone else. He said he denied the affair again, even then. He said he told her he did not think the marriage would work. He described her pleading and fear and anger. He described her saying he was hurting the baby and warning that he would not see the children again. He said that in the middle of that conversation, he put his hands around her neck and strangled her. He described what happened immediately after in the language of confusion, but the actions he described were not confused actions. They were steps. They were concealment. They were movement and planning under pressure. He said their older daughter came into the room holding a blanket and asked what was wrong with her mother. He said he told the child that her mother did not feel good. He said he wrapped Shanann in a bedsheet. He said he tried to carry her down the stairs, lost his grip, and dragged her. He said the child watched and cried and asked again what was wrong. He said he repeated the same answer, that her mother did not feel good. He described backing his truck into the driveway and loading Shanann into the vehicle. He described both children being awake and moving around the house. He described how the noise of the body being dragged down the stairs may have woken the younger child. He described leaving the house with the children in the truck and driving to the oil site. This is the moment where the case becomes almost unbearable in its ordinariness. The road to the worksite was a road he had driven before. The worksite was a place he belonged. It was a place he could explain. He described the drive as if time stopped inside his head, but he also described the children interacting in the back seat, dozing, holding each other, and noticing the smell as they approached the tanks. At this site, he described pulling Shanann from the truck and placing her on the ground near where she would be buried. He described the children still in the truck as he did it. He described them asking what he was doing to their mother. Then he described killing the children at the site and placing their bodies into the oil tanks. He described doing it in a way that shows sequence, not chaos. He described closing hatches. He described going back to the truck. He described the older child asking where the younger child went, and then asking if the same thing would happen to her. He described killing her next. He described one child being more difficult to fit through the hatch than the other. He described placing the children into separate tanks. He said they were not alive when he put them into the tanks. After that, he described burying Shanann in a shallow grave near the tanks. He described digging with a shovel. He described clearing weeds with a rake and breaking the rake. He described leaving part of it behind. He also described the cleanup behavior that followed, the behavior that explains why the house looked too normal at first glance. He said he changed clothes using extra clothing kept in his work truck. He said he disposed of the clothing in the blanket from the site in a construction dumpster in his neighborhood on the way home. He said he threw away the bedsheet later, and he gave a reason that showed he was thinking about trace evidence and odor, not only guilt. Then the interview moved through the psychological layer that people keep searching for. He described rage at Shanann and fear of losing his children, and he described taking that rage out on everyone in front of him that morning. He described himself as someone who had never been angry like that before. He described the feeling of being out of control, as if something else was driving him. He described regret that arrived too late after the irreversible actions were done. He also talked about the lifestyle product patches he wore, including a specific type he said made his heart rate run high and made him feel like he could go longer each day while sleeping only a few hours per night. He described how people wrote to his parents claiming the patches were not approved and could alter a mind. He said his parents believed he had been railroaded and pressured to plead guilty. He said he did not feel pressured, and he said his defense team asked him repeatedly before he chose the plea. None of these statements changed the legal truth. They only changed the cultural story. Because when this prison interview was released publicly in redacted form, the case surged back into headlines. People who already believed they knew everything suddenly had new details to absorb. The public reassembled the timeline again. The internet argued again. The case, which had been finished in court, became alive again in culture. At the same time, the official system had to manage the constant demand for documents. The Weld County District Attorney's Office created a formal process to streamline public records requests for materials released in the case. Because interest was not fading, they also made clear that the prison interview materials were not theirs to release, and that requests for that interview had to go through the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. That is how a case becomes a permanent archive. A home becomes body camera footage. A driveway becomes a surveillance clip. A workplace becomes a digital trail. A confession becomes a marked photograph. A plea becomes a sentencing transcript. A prison interview becomes a new wave of public attention. But the center of the story remains the same, and it never improves with repetition. A mother and two small children were killed. An unborn child was lost. A husband and father tried to replace reality with a story that would buy him time, and the system, built out of records and verification, did what it was designed to do. It stripped away the story until only the facts remained. In the next part, the focus turns to what the prison interview reveals about motive and method, not as entertainment, but as a warning. Because the most dangerous part of this case is not the oil tanks or the headlines. It is the pattern that allowed a normal exterior to hide a collapsing interior until the moment violence became a choice. The February 2019 prison interview did not change the verdict, but it changed the way the story could be understood, because it showed what was underneath the public mask after the legal stakes were gone. When investigators arrived at the Wisconsin prison, they were not chasing a new suspect, and they were not offering a deal. They were closing the record. They told Watts they wanted clarity, and they also wanted to address claims that he had additional affairs during his marriage, because rumors do not stay rumors when a case becomes permanent public history. That detail matters because it shows what investigators were trying to prevent. They were trying to prevent a future where the case could be rewritten by noise, where new names could be inserted into the narrative without proof, and where the public would mistake speculation for evidence. In the interview, Watts talked about life after conviction in a way that sounded almost administrative. He compared county jail to prison. He described threats in Colorado. He described being able to move more normally in Wisconsin. He described receiving letters from strangers. He described talking to his family by phone. But then the conversation moved into the real subject, which was not prison life. It was motive, method, and the way he tried to manage perception from the first hour of the investigation. What emerged was a portrait of a man who lived by avoidance. He avoided conflict. He avoided direct honesty. He avoided saying the hard sentence that would have ended his marriage in the open. And when avoidance became pressure, he did not choose a clean break. He chose erasure. He described the affair as a separate world, a world where he felt lighter and new. He described hiding communications and managing what Shanann could see. He described how secrecy became routine, and that is one of the most important points in the entire case. When secrecy becomes routine, lying stops feeling like an emergency measure and starts feeling like a lifestyle. Once that happens, a person can start treating truth as optional. He also described the home life in terms that showed emotional distance. He described tension. He described money stress. He described arguments. He described a future that felt heavy. He described a new relationship that felt like an exit. This is where the prison interview functions like a warning, because it exposes a pattern that can exist in many homes without anyone noticing it. The pattern begins with silence. Silence becomes resentment. Resentment becomes a private story where the spouse is framed as the obstacle. The children are framed as part of the obstacle. The future is framed as something that can only be reached by removing what exists in the present. Once a person starts thinking that way, the next behavior is image management. Watts talked about image management directly and indirectly. He described how he tried to stage the home and the story, not with dramatic actions, but with small signals designed to make the disappearance look voluntary. He described the way he wanted others to interpret what they saw. He described choices that were meant to guide the narrative before investigators could control it. This is also where the interview makes the earlier footage feel even colder. The porch interview was not only a man pleading, it was a man performing a script while evidence was already closing in. The welfare check footage was not only a search, It was a stage where he tried to appear helpful while his story stayed vague and unprovable. In the prison interview, he described the moment where the original lie began to collapse. He described the polygraph day as a point of no return. He described knowing investigators had information he could not outrun, including the affair. He described the feeling of being cornered, and cornered is where many offenders try one final tactic. They try to move blame. That is what happened in his first confession. He tried to attach the origin of the violence to Shanann. In prison, he acknowledged the story had been shaped by panic and self-protection, and he described how quickly he reached for a version that might make him look less monstrous in the eyes of his father and the world. This matters because it is a reminder that confessions are not always truth. Sometimes confessions are negotiation. Sometimes they are damage control. Sometimes they are a person trying to control how they will be remembered. The prison interview also exposed something else. It exposed how he thought about time. He did not describe a blur of events where he had no awareness. He described sequences. He described decisions. He described steps he took afterward to avoid detection. Those steps are not the language of an accident. They are the language of someone who understands consequence and tries to manage it. And that is the hardest truth in this case. The most frightening family crimes are not the ones where the offender looks obviously unstable. The most frightening ones are the ones where the offender looks normal, speaks calmly, goes to work, and still makes deliberate choices that destroy everyone who trusted him. After the prison interview became public, the case entered a new phase again, because the public record expanded. A district attorney's office does not usually have to manage worldwide demand for a single case file, but this case was not ordinary. The Weld County District Attorney's Office created a formal process to streamline record requests, and it made two things clear. The released files were huge, and the office was not the custodian of the February 2019 prison interview. If someone wanted that interview report, they had to request it through the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. That is not a small procedural detail. It is a sign of scale. It means the case had become an archive, not only a prosecution. It means the tragedy had become a permanent public artifact, requested, downloaded, rewatched, reread, and repackaged. And this is where the story becomes uncomfortable in a different way. The more records exist, the more people believe they can solve the why, as if motive is a code that can be cracked with enough documents. But motive is not a code. Motive is usually a mixture of weakness, selfishness, fantasy, and avoidance. The prison interview did not provide a perfect why. It provided a pattern. The pattern is this. A double life creates a fantasy. A fantasy creates impatience. Impatience creates resentment. Resentment creates a private story where other people become obstacles. Once people become obstacles, empathy collapses. Once empathy collapses, violence becomes possible. And once violence happens, image management begins immediately, because the offender is still trying to protect the only thing he cares about at that point, his own future. The Watts case is often discussed as a case about evidence and speed, because the confession and recovery happened quickly. But the deeper lesson is about the danger of a person who never learned to confront conflict honestly, and who used secrecy to build a separate identity. In the next part, the focus turns to the legal choice that ended the case without a trial, and why a plea deal can create closure in court while leaving the public stuck in a loop, searching for details that a trial would have exposed, but a plea keeps buried inside documents. By the time the prison interview was written into the record, the legal story had already ended months earlier, not with a jury verdict, but with a negotiated finality. That ending matters because it explains why the Watts case feels both complete and incomplete at the same time. Complete because the outcome is permanent. Incomplete because a full trial never forced every piece of evidence into open court. After the recoveries at Cervi 319, prosecutors did not need a long investigation to identify a suspect. They already had the suspect, the confession, the disposal site, and a case structure that could be proven with documents, recordings, and forensic findings. But a case is not only about proof. A case is also about process. In Colorado at the time, a first-degree murder case could be charged in a way that left the death penalty on the table, and that possibility hangs over every strategic decision in the months that follow. A death penalty case is not simply a more severe sentence. It is a different legal ecosystem. It takes longer. It generates more hearings. It generates more expert witnesses. It generates more appeals. It increases the time a family must spend living inside the details. So even when the evidence is strong, prosecutors still have to decide what kind of case they are trying to build and what outcome they can guarantee. In the Watts case, that decision was shaped by the people who had already lost everything. Shanann Watts' family told the Weld County District Attorney that they did not want the death penalty pursued. That statement changed the path. It turned the question from maximum punishment to maximum certainty. Because when the death penalty is removed from consideration, the defense has less leverage, and a plea can become the cleanest route to a sentence that will never change. The public often misunderstands what a plea deal means in a case like this. A plea deal is not a gift. It is not mercy. It is not an escape. It is a trade. The defendant gives up the right to trial and admits guilt in open court. The state gives up the death penalty and secures a sentence that removes the defendant from society forever. The family is spared years of litigation and years of hearing the same horror repeated in front of cameras. That is why the plea became possible. By early November 2018, the legal calendar had moved toward a status conference, and the case was positioned for the next stage. But on November 6th, Christopher Watts entered the courtroom and pleaded guilty. He pleaded guilty to murdering Shanann Watts, and he pleaded guilty to murdering Bella Watts. He pleaded guilty to murdering Celeste Watts. He also pleaded guilty to the unlawful termination of Shanann's pregnancy, and he pleaded guilty to the counts tied to tampering with deceased human bodies. That is the part many people forget. The plea was not a narrow admission. It was an admission to the full framework of what the state had charged. From the state's perspective, the advantage was obvious. A trial is a risk, even in an overwhelming case. A trial invites defense strategies designed to create doubt, shift blame, or confuse sequence. A trial can become a stage where the defendant tries to control the narrative again, even from the defense table. And a trial always creates an appeal record because every ruling becomes a future argument. A plea collapses those risks. A plea means there is no jury to persuade and no cross-examination to endure. A plea means the defendant cannot later claim he never admitted responsibility. A plea means sentencing becomes the final chapter, not the start of a multi-year fight. But for the public, the plea created a different kind of tension. Because the public does not only want outcome, the public wants explanation. A trial explains a case through confrontation. Witnesses testify. Experts testify. Evidence is displayed. The defendant's lies are cut apart in public. The motive becomes a matter of argument. When there is no trial, the motive remains a shadow. People still ask why. People still search for a hidden accomplice. People still try to turn the story into something more complex, because complexity can feel safer than the idea that a father can decide his children are disposable. That is the psychological gap a plea can leave behind. 2 weeks after the guilty plea, the case moved into sentencing. On November 19, 2018, a judge imposed multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. The structure of the sentence matters. It was not one life sentence. It was multiple life sentences with portions that were consecutive, designed to ensure that even if laws or rules changed, the legal outcome would remain permanent. Additional years were also added for the unlawful termination of the pregnancy and for the tampering counts. At sentencing, the judge used language that cut through the procedural tone of court. He described the crime as perhaps the most inhumane and vicious case he had seen out of thousands of cases. That statement matters because it reflects something the public felt immediately but could not always articulate. This was not only murder, it was annihilation. The sentencing hearing also showed why the plea deal can be both necessary and painful. Necessary because it ensures certainty. Painful because it forces the victim's family to speak into a room where nothing can be repaired. Victim impact statements are not designed to convince a judge. They are designed to create a permanent human record inside a system that otherwise speaks in numbers and statutes. In that courtroom, the focus was not on oil tanks or surveillance footage or phone records. The focus was on the stolen future, on the children who would never grow up, on the mother who would never return, on the unborn child whose life ended before it began, on grandparents who would never see birthdays and ordinary mornings that once felt guaranteed. When sentencing ended, the court's job was done. But another job began immediately, a job the system does not always talk about: security. High-profile inmates can destabilize facilities. They attract attention. They become targets. They force staff to make decisions about movement, separation, and safety. In early December 2018, corrections officials moved Chris Watts out of Colorado due to security concerns. He was transferred to a maximum security prison in Wisconsin, where he would serve the rest of his sentence. That transfer closed the geographic chapter of the case. The home was in Frederick. The disposal site was in Weld County. The court was in Greeley. But the sentence followed him across state lines, and yet the story did not quiet down. Because once a plea deal ends a case quickly, the public often tries to reopen it through documents. People want the missing trial, they want the exhibits, they want the interviews. They want every page that explains the why. So the case became something else. It became an archive. The Weld County District Attorney's Office created a public process for requesting materials released in the case. A form existed. A procedure existed. A system existed to handle the scale of attention that would not fade. This is another consequence of a plea. When there is no trial, the courtroom does not become the main place where the narrative is revealed. Documents become the narrative. Recordings become the narrative. Released reports become the narrative. And once those reports circulate, the public begins to treat them like episodes, moving from one file to the next, building meaning from fragments. This is where the case becomes uncomfortable in a new way. Because an archive is not a story. An archive is a pile of truth. It includes verified facts. It includes contradictions. It includes human reactions. It includes panic and confusion and performance. A trial shapes the archive into a single line the court recognizes as the official narrative. A plea leaves the archive more open. and the internet fills that openness with speculation. In the Watts case, prosecutors secured the most important outcome they could secure: permanent incarceration without parole. But they also understood what they were giving up. They were giving up the public cleansing of a trial, the moment where the defendant's performance would be dismantled under oath. Instead, the case would live through paperwork and recordings, and through the later prison interview that investigators conducted in February 2019. That is why the prison interview became so significant. It was not legally necessary. It was narratively inevitable. When a case ends fast, investigators sometimes return later to close the gaps that would have been filled by trial testimony. They do it to create a clearer record. They do it to prevent future myths from taking root. They do it because a plea can end the court fight, but it does not always end the public hunger for explanation. So, the legal ending of the Watts case can be understood in one clear line. The family asked the state not to seek the death penalty. The state negotiated a plea. The defendant admitted guilt to the full set of charges. The court imposed multiple life sentences without parole and additional years. The system removed the defendant from society permanently. The case ended in court quickly. The case continued in culture endlessly. And the reason it continued is the same reason it began as a national fixation. Because the crime did not look like a crime at first. It looked like a missing family. It looked like a worried husband. It looked like a normal home in a normal neighborhood. Then the truth arrived fast, and once the truth arrived, the legal system chose certainty over spectacle. That choice was practical. That choice was protective. That choice was final. But it also left an echo where people keep returning to the same footage, the same interviews, and the same documents, searching for a why that will never feel proportional to what was done. Because no sentence, no matter how permanent, can make the crime feel understandable. It can only make it irreversible. The plea deal ended the case in court, but it created something else in the public world. It created an archive. In a trial, the archive is revealed slowly, under rules, inside a courtroom, with a judge controlling what a jury sees and when they see it. In this case, there was no trial. So, the archive escaped into the open in a different way, through documents, recordings, and public records releases. That shift changed the experience of the case for everyone watching. Instead of hearing one official narrative built through testimony, the public began consuming the case the way the internet consumes everything: in fragments, in clips, in pages, in screenshots, in audio pulled apart sentence by sentence. That is what happened in early March of 2019. The redacted report of the February 18th prison interview and related materials were released publicly, and for many people, it felt like the missing chapter, the chapter that a trial would have forced into open court. The man who had already been sentenced to die in prison was now speaking again, not to negotiate his future, but to explain his past, and that is why the release had such an impact. It did not change the legal truth. It changed the psychological story. It gave the public a new timeline to argue over, a new set of details to weigh, and a new reason to re-watch the old footage with a colder interpretation. But when a case becomes a downloadable archive, something dangerous happens. The case stops belonging only to the families and the court system. It becomes a resource. It becomes fuel. It becomes content. People with good intentions use the archive to understand how investigations work and how deception collapses under verification. People with bad intentions use the archive to build conspiracies, because a conspiracy can be built out of any gap, and a plea deal always leaves gaps. The more pages there are, the more people believe there must be a hidden answer inside them. They begin treating ordinary human behaviors as coded signals. They treat panic as guilt. They treat deleting messages as proof of murder. They treat hesitations in speech as evidence of a plot. They turn a solved case into a puzzle they refuse to stop solving. This is where the Watts case became a permanent machine. Every time a new file appeared, the machine restarted. A new report created a new argument. A new audio clip created a new theory. A new timeline graphic created a new villain. And because the core crime was so shocking, people kept looking for explanations that felt equal to the horror. They looked for a mastermind. They looked for a partner. They looked for something that would make the story less terrifying than the simplest truth. The simplest truth is that one person chose annihilation, then tried to buy time with performance. The archive made that truth harder to ignore, because the archive preserved the performance in real time. It preserved the welfare check. It preserved the neighbor video. It preserved the interviews. It preserved the moment when his story broke. And then it preserved the later prison interview where he spoke about method, motive, and the way he tried to manage perception. As public interest continued, the system had to adapt. A district attorney's office is not built to handle a global audience demanding access to a single case file. So, a formal process was created for requesting access to released Watts case materials. It was bureaucratic, but it was necessary because the demand was not fading. The case had become bigger than the county. It had become a permanent reference point. A case that people would use to talk about family annihilation, deception, media performance, and the speed of modern investigations. But every new release also created a new cost for the survivors, because survivors do not experience the archive as information. They experience it as replay. They experience it as strangers turning their daughter and grandchildren into a timeline and a comment section. They experience it as a world that refuses to let the dead rest quietly. This is the part of the story that rarely gets said out loud. A case can be solved and still keep injuring the living. A plea deal can spare a family a long trial and still leave them trapped in an endless public retelling. A life sentence can remove the killer from society and still allow his words to circulate forever. The Watts case became that kind of case, a closed courtroom, a permanent sentence, and an open archive that keeps pulling the story back into the present. Because once a tragedy becomes content, it does not end when the judge speaks. It ends only when people choose to stop feeding it. And in this case, the world did not stop. It only found new ways to watch. One of the new ways the world watched was through dramatization, because once a case becomes famous, someone will always try to turn it into a script. In January of 2020, Shanann Watts' family publicly denounced a Lifetime production based on the murders. They said they had not been consulted. They said they were not making money from it. And they said they feared it would reignite conspiracy theories and online harassment that had already targeted them. They were not arguing about the verdict. They were arguing about the cost of being forced to relive the same week as entertainment. That moment exposed a truth many people prefer not to face. A courtroom can close a case, but it cannot close a market. A sentence can remove a killer from society, but it cannot stop society from packaging the tragedy again and again. For the public, dramatizations feel like understanding. For survivors, dramatizations can feel like intrusion. A scene on television can turn real grief into a product, and a product invites commentary. and commentary invites cruelty, because the internet is built to reward reaction more than respect. Later that same year, the case moved through a different pipeline, one that did not need actors or reenactments, because the story already had an archive of reality. On September 30th, 2020, Netflix released American Murder: The Family Next Door. The documentary used raw first-hand footage and records to examine the disappearance and what followed. It assembled home videos, social media posts, messages, and law enforcement recordings into a timeline that felt intimate, because it let the family's own digital life speak for itself. This style of storytelling has a power a courtroom does not have. It can place viewers inside the emotional weather of the days before the disappearance. It can show ordinary moments that later become unbearable, because the audience knows those moments are ending. But that same power can also trap the victims in a loop. The documentary can preserve their humanity, and it can also preserve their last days as a permanent exhibit. It can create empathy in viewers, and it can also create a new wave of strangers who feel entitled to analyze the family's private life as if private life were evidence. When the public consumes a case through footage instead of testimony, a strange thing happens. People begin confusing proximity with expertise. They watch a porch interview and feel like they can diagnose guilt. They watch body camera footage and feel like they can interpret motive. They watch texts and feel like they can assign blame. And in a case like this, blame is always looking for a new direction, because the simplest truth is terrifying. The simplest truth is that a father decided his children were obstacles, and a husband decided his pregnant wife was an obstacle, and he tried to erase them instead of leaving like an adult. If people accept that truth, they have to accept that evil can wear an ordinary face. They have to accept that a person can be quiet, polite, employed, and still capable of annihilation. So the internet reaches for complexity because complexity feels safer. It reaches for hidden partners because hidden partners feel like a reason. It reaches for coded signs because coded signs feel like control. That is why every new release of paperwork functions like gasoline. In March of 2019, the redacted report of the February 18th prison interview was released publicly. That report gave the public what a trial never provided: a long, procedural, detail-heavy account collected after sentencing, when the legal outcome could not be negotiated anymore. To investigators, that follow-up interview was about closing the record. It was about documenting. It was about clarifying inconsistencies and preserving statements. To the public, it became another episode. It became another reason to re-watch the old footage and reinterpret every moment with a colder lens. It became another document that people could screenshot and circulate and argue over, line by line, as if debate itself could produce meaning. Then, in the years that followed, the case entered the phase that notorious cases often enter. The phase where new claims appear through intermediaries. These claims are powerful because they arrive after the courtroom is silent. They arrive into a space where the public wants more explanation and where a convicted killer's words can still create headlines. In June of 2021, Inside Edition reported on letters Watts allegedly wrote to a pen pal. In that reporting, the pen pal said Watts made additional confessions, including claims that he planned the murders for weeks and claims involving attempts to end Shanann's pregnancy and alleged earlier attempts to harm the children. These claims were presented through the lens of a third party and through letters, not through court testimony or cross-examination. This is where discipline matters. A convicted murderer may tell the truth in one sentence and manipulate the next. He may exaggerate to feel powerful. He may reshape events to control how he is remembered. He may claim planning to sound dominant. He may claim chaos to sound less responsible. And because he has nothing left to lose legally, attention can become the last form of control available to him. So, the public must hold two truths at the same time. The first truth is the stable truth, the one the legal system already proved. A pregnant mother and two small children were killed. Their bodies were recovered. The killer pleaded guilty. The sentence ensured he would never be released. The second truth is the unstable truth, the one that appears through late claims and second-hand accounts. Those claims may contain pieces of reality, but they also may contain distortion, and they should not be allowed to replace the verified record. This is why the Watts case became more than a file and more than a documentary. It became a lesson in the modern afterlife of crime. In the 20th century, a case like this might have faded into a few newspaper clippings and a court transcript. In the 21st century, it becomes a searchable archive, and the archive becomes content, and content becomes a loop. That loop carries consequences. It brings strangers to the victims' families again and again, with theories that treat the dead like characters instead of people. It invites harassment because the internet rewards certainty, and the easiest certainty is scapegoating. It keeps the killer's name circulating because platforms reward controversy, and controversy keeps attention alive. The most important decision in a case like this is not made by a judge. It is made by the audience. The audience decides whether to treat the archive as evidence of how deception collapses under verification, or as entertainment to be mined for drama. The audience decides whether to center the victims or to center the killer. The audience decides whether to respect the boundary between verified facts and reported claims, or to treat every rumor as a clue. Because when a case becomes a permanent archive, it will not end on its own. It will not quiet down on its own. It will only quiet down when people stop feeding it, when people stop turning grief into a product, and when people stop rewarding the endless retelling of the same loss. The court already delivered the only ending the law can deliver. A permanent sentence, a closed door. What remains is the cultural ending, the one the public writes every time it clicks, every time it shares, and every time it decides what kind of story it is really consuming. And if the public wants to take anything honest from this case, it has to begin with a refusal to turn the victims into a spectacle. Because the true horror here is not the existence of documents, and not the existence of footage, and not the existence of a documentary. The true horror is that a family's real life became raw material, and the world proved it would never stop watching unless it chose to. The cultural afterlife of the Watts case did not stop when the judge finished sentencing, because a closed courtroom does not close the world's appetite for narrative. After November 2018, the system had already delivered its hardest promise, which was that Chris Watts would never be free again. But the survivors still faced a different fight. They faced the fight against profit, against sensationalism, and against the possibility that the man who killed their daughter and grandchildren could someday benefit from the story he created. That is why Shanann's parents filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Chris Watts in late 2018. The lawsuit was not only about money, it was also about control. It was about funeral costs, damages, and future losses. And it was also about preventing him from earning from media, interviews, or any deal that might be built on the murders. In a case like this, civil court becomes a second boundary. Criminal court decides guilt and punishment. Civil court tries to reduce the ways a killer can turn attention into advantage. Months later, the lawsuit did not explode into a dramatic courtroom clash because Chris Watts was already in prison, and his legal position was already collapsed. The civil case moved toward a conclusion that was both symbolic and practical. In December 2019, he agreed to a civil judgment of $6 million to Shanann's parents. Everyone understood the reality. A judgment does not create money inside a prison cell, but a judgment can still matter. It can still function as a permanent legal statement of liability. It can still block future profit. It can still place a debt on the record that follows him, so that any future revenue tied to the case becomes vulnerable to seizure. While those civil steps were unfolding, the correction system was making its own decisions behind the scenes. Chris Watts did not remain in Colorado long after sentencing. In December 2018, he was transferred to the Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, Wisconsin. The reason given publicly was security. High-profile inmates can destabilize facilities. They can become targets. They can create risk for staff and for other incarcerated people. So the system moved him out of state, away from the community where the murders occurred, and into a maximum security prison where his life could be managed under stricter conditions. That transfer created another kind of distance. The distance between the crime and the punishment. The home was still in Frederick. The oil site was still in Weld County. The graves were still in Colorado memory, but the person responsible was now locked behind a different set of walls in a different state, and the legal system considered that the only kind of safety it could offer. Then the archive expanded again. In February 2019, investigators interviewed Watts in prison. Soon after, state authorities publicly discussed releasing a written report and an audio file of that interview, and that promise signaled something important. The case was legally over, but the record was still being assembled for history. Because a plea deal ends a trial, but it does not automatically answer every question the public will ask forever. That is how the case became two things at the same time. It became a closed prosecution and an open archive. The archive is what allowed the world to keep watching. It is also what created new waves of pain for the surviving families, because each new file and each new headline reopens the same week in a different form. In early 2020, the conflict between grief and entertainment became public again. Shanann's family denounced a Lifetime film based on the murders. They said they were not consulted, and they warned that dramatization could reignite harassment and conspiracy theories that had already surrounded them. Their statement revealed the truth beneath the true crime industry. A family can beg for privacy, and the market can still decide that their tragedy is a product. Then, later that same year, the case reached an even larger audience through a different kind of storytelling. On September 30th, 2020, Netflix released American Murder: The Family Next Door. The documentary used raw material, including social media footage, text messages, and law enforcement recordings, to build a timeline that felt intimate. For many viewers, it felt like a new kind of shock because it did not rely on actors to create emotional proximity. It relied on the family's real life, preserved in their own videos and their own messages. That approach created empathy, but it also created a new surge of attention. And attention has consequences. Attention makes documents circulate again. Attention makes people reopen theories again. Attention makes strangers feel entitled to analyze a marriage they never lived inside. In the Watts case, attention also intensified the public's desire to extract motive. People wanted a single answer, and that could make the horror feel proportional. They wanted a villain beyond Chris. They wanted a hidden hand, a missing accomplice, a reason that felt big enough. But the more the archive grew, the harder it became to hide the simplest truth. The simplest truth was that Chris Watts chose to erase his family, and then he tried to perform innocence long enough to buy time. That is why the case stayed alive even after sentencing, because the evidence of the performance was preserved. The porch interview existed. The body camera footage existed. The interrogation existed. The marked photograph existed. And once those pieces exist, a case can loop forever inside the culture, because new audiences keep discovering the same footage as if it happened yesterday. Then the case entered the phase that notorious cases often enter, which is the phase of second-hand claims. Years after conviction, new claims can appear through letters, through intermediaries, and through people who correspond with an infamous prisoner. Those claims do not carry the weight of courtroom testimony. They are not cross-examined. They are not tested the way evidence is tested, but they can still create headlines because a convicted killer's words still have the power to provoke reaction. In June 2021, Inside Edition reported claims from a woman described as a pen pal who said Watts wrote additional statements about planning the murders weeks in advance and about giving Shanann oxycodone, among other allegations. The public reacted the way the public always reacts. Some people treated it as final truth. Other people treated it as manipulation. The disciplined position is this: the verified record does not need new claims to remain true. The verified record already proves what happened in August 2018. A confession was obtained. Bodies were recovered. A plea was entered. A sentence was imposed. Civil liability was recorded. Everything else, especially anything filtered through letters and third parties, has to be treated as unstable unless it is supported by independent evidence. And that brings the Watts case to its final modern form. A solved homicide that continues to create new harm through exposure. A family that cannot escape the story because the story has become profitable content. A murderer who has nothing left to lose legally, and who can still influence the public narrative by allowing fragments to surface through other people. A court system that delivered certainty but cannot deliver silence. If there is a lesson here, it is not about whether true crime should exist. It is about what the audience rewards. When the audience rewards sensation, the market delivers sensation. When the audience rewards speculation, speculation becomes a business. When the audience rewards the killer's voice survives longer than the victim's dignity. The only ending the law can offer is permanent incarceration. The cultural ending is different. The cultural ending is written by every click, every share, and every retelling. And the only way to stop the loop is to refuse to treat a family's real suffering as a form of entertainment that never has to end. After the confession and the recoveries, the state had what it needed to hold Christopher Watts for life. But the case was not only evidence and charges. It was also a media storm that threatened to contaminate everything around it. In late August of 2018, his defense attorneys filed motions focused on publicity and leaks because the case had become national news before the court process could stabilize. They argued that details of the investigation were already appearing in media reports, while the defense had not even received discovery. They warned that unnamed sources were discussing evidence and credibility in ways that could poison the jury pool before a jury was ever selected. Inside those filings was a blunt complaint. They stated that more than a week after his first court appearance, the defense had not received a single page of discovery, while news outlets were circulating alleged investigative details, and a gossip outlet published a story quoting a source described as close to the investigation, with commentary about evidence and guilt. This was not a moral argument. It was a tactical warning. If you are charged with killing your entire family, you do not want the public to hear the state's narrative through leaks before the defense can even see the file. You do not want investigators and prosecutors or anyone near them shaping perception through anonymous quotes. You want the case to live inside court rules, because court rules are the only environment where evidence is tested and not simply repeated. The filing also pointed to a court order that had already been entered to limit pretrial publicity. That meant the court recognized early that the case was already in danger of becoming a spectacle that could interfere with fair process. What makes this moment important is that it shows the system dealing with two realities at once. One reality was the physical evidence and the admissions that already pointed to guilt. The other reality was the public narrative, which was expanding faster than the courtroom could contain it. In many cases, those realities moved together. In this case, the public narrative sprinted ahead, and the defense tried to slow it down. Then, the case ended even faster than the media cycle expected. On November 6, 2018, Watts pleaded guilty. The plea deal removed the death penalty and locked in permanent incarceration. A trial vanished from the calendar, and with it vanished the one process that would have forced the state to reveal its full story in open court. That created a different problem. Without a trial, the public still wanted the missing chapters, and the only place those chapters could come from was the archive. So, in the weeks after the plea, more documentation began surfacing through public records and media requests. In November 2018, reporting noted that more than 2,000 pages of documents were released in response to a records request, including texts that helped show how the marriage looked from the inside as it was collapsing. As demand kept growing, the Weld County District Attorney's Office later published formal instructions for requesting access to released Watts case materials, because the case had become too large to handle informally. This is how a murder case becomes a permanent public file. A trial would have created one official narrative told in sequence. A plea created a permanent sentence, and then the narrative scattered into documents, recordings, and releases that people could consume in any order. That is why, years later, the case still feels like it never stops. Even when the court closes, the archive stays open. And when an archive stays open, the story can be restarted by anyone at any time, simply by opening the next file. After the plea, the courtroom went quiet, but the case did not go quiet. The case began to live through documents. In late November of 2018, the Weld County District Attorney's Office released more than 2,000 pages of investigative documents in response to a Colorado Criminal Justice Records request. Those pages contained reports, interviews, and messages that showed what the marriage looked like in the final days. They showed Shanann reaching out to friends with fear and confusion. They showed her trying to understand why Chris had turned cold. They also showed Chris building a second life and hiding it with routine. For many people, that document release felt like the trial they never got. It gave the public raw material. It gave the internet new sentences to argue over. It also gave the families a new kind of pain, because private messages became public forever. As requests kept coming, the district attorney's office created a formal process for people to request access to released Watts case materials. That step matters because it shows scale. A local office had to build a public pipeline just to handle demand. Then, in March of 2019, the archive expanded again. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation released a report and audio tied to the February 18th prison interview with Chris Watts. That release gave the public more detail about what he said after sentencing. It also gave the public a new reason to reopen the story again. Every new report became a new wave. Every new wave created new headlines. Every headline pulled the victims back into the center of attention. This is the modern afterlife of a solved case. The sentence is permanent, but the story remains renewable. The records can be downloaded. The clips can be replayed. The same moments can be watched by new audiences for years. And when the story is renewable, the case never fully leaves the present. It becomes a file people return to, not because the verdict is uncertain, but because the culture keeps trying to extract a why that will never feel big enough. The law gave the only ending it can give: a guilty plea. Life without parole, a locked door. The rest is what the public chooses to do with the archive. When the plea deal ended the courtroom fight, it did not end the case's public life, because the case had already turned into a file people demanded to see. That demand became concrete on November 21st, 2018, when the Weld County District Attorney's Office released more than 2,000 pages of investigative documents in response to a Colorado Criminal Justice Records request. The release did not feel like paperwork to the public. It felt like a replacement for the trial that never happened. It turned private messages into public exhibits. It turned ordinary routines into evidence. It turned the final week of a family's life into a searchable timeline. Inside those pages, the story became clear in the most painful way, because it showed two realities running at once. One reality was Shanann's reality, the one where she was pregnant, trying to hold the marriage together and trying to understand why her husband had become distant and cold. The other reality was the secret track, the one where he was building a different future through a hidden relationship while still living inside the original home. The documents contained the kinds of details that do not look dramatic in isolation, but become overwhelming when they are stacked together. They contained summaries of interviews that captured how quickly concern escalated when she stopped responding. They contained accounts of how her friend Nicole Atkinson treated the silence as an emergency rather than a delay, because she knew Shanann's routines and knew something was wrong. They contained digital fragments that showed how quickly investigators moved from a missing family narrative to a deception narrative, because digital life leaves prints that do not match a staged story. The release also exposed why the affair mattered so much to investigators. It did not matter because it made the crime more cinematic. It mattered because it proved he could live a double life for weeks while acting normal in front of the people closest to him. It mattered because he denied the affair early, and that denial collapsed as soon as workplace and phone evidence were examined. It mattered because the affair gave him a fantasy that treated his family as an obstacle to a new life. The name attached to that fantasy was Nicole Kessinger. Once her name entered the public conversation, the archive became even more volatile because a second storyline formed outside court, in the space where people confused suspicion with proof. The released materials helped show what investigators were actually doing with the affair. They were mapping time. They were mapping contact. They were comparing statements to records. They were treating it as context for motive and deception, not as a substitute suspect. Even so, the public reacted the way the public often reacts in notorious cases. People wanted a plot large enough to match the horror. People wanted a second villain. because a second villain makes the crime feel less like a single person's choice and more like a conspiracy with an explanation. The archive did not satisfy that desire. The archive did something colder. It showed how a simple, selfish fantasy can grow until it becomes impatience, and how impatience can become resentment, and how resentment can become a private story where a spouse and children are framed as the barrier. That private story is not insanity. It is moral collapse. The same November release also produced another effect. It created a new type of audience, an audience that did not only watch documentaries, but read case files. They compared interview summaries and timelines. They screenshotted pages and circulated them. They treated the record as if it were a puzzle. That behavior forced the legal system to adapt because the demand was not fading. The Weld County District Attorney's Office eventually built a dedicated public page to streamline access requests for Watt's case materials because the volume of requests had become too large to handle informally. That step matters because it signals how the case had changed form. It was no longer only a prosecution. It was a permanent archive. A permanent archive creates permanent replays. Then the archive grew again, and the next wave hit with a date that people remember because it reactivated the case globally. On March 7, 2019, the Colorado Bureau of Investigation released a redacted report documenting a follow-up prison interview conducted on February 18, 2019. The follow-up interview did not exist to decide guilt. Guilt was already admitted. The interview existed to close gaps that a trial would have explored and to document his account in a structured way after sentencing. When bargaining was irrelevant, media outlets published warnings about the graphic nature of what he described, and transcripts and audio circulated widely. The public did what it always does with new material. It rewatched everything again, but with a different lens. It rewatched the porch interview with the knowledge that the case had already ended in a marked photograph and an oil field. It rewatched the welfare check footage with the knowledge that the missing family story was already dead inside the house. It reread the earlier document release and tried to align every sentence with the newer account. A trial would have delivered one official narrative. A plea delivered a sentence, and then the narrative escaped through releases, and each release created a new surge of attention. That is why this case never truly leaves the present. The archive is designed for access. Access creates circulation. Circulation creates retelling. Retelling creates a market. A market creates new content. And new content makes new audiences. And new audiences return to the archive as if the tragedy just happened. None of that changes the legal truth. It only changes the cultural temperature. It keeps the victims' names in circulation. It keeps the killer's voice circulating too, even though his voice should have ended the moment the sentence was imposed. It also keeps survivors under pressure, because every new wave invites strangers to debate a family's private life as if grief were evidence and pain were entertainment. This is the modern shape of a solved case. The court provides an ending that is final. The archive provides an ending that is renewable. The public chooses which ending it will live inside. In the Watts case, the public kept choosing renewal. The files kept opening. The clips kept replaying. The story kept restarting, and the closer people thought they were getting to the why, the more the archive reminded them of the most frightening truth in the entire record. The why was never going to feel intelligent or proportional. The why was a weak man trying to turn responsibility into something he could erase. The why was a fantasy of escape that he refused to pursue honestly. The why was a decision to annihilate a family instead of facing the consequences of leaving. That is why the archive keeps pulling people back. the evidence is not only proof of guilt, it is proof that an ordinary exterior can hide a total collapse of empathy until the moment violence becomes a choice. And once the evidence exists in public, the story becomes something the world can replay forever, unless it chooses to stop. When the courtroom ended the fight with a guilty plea, the public did not stop asking for an explanation because there had been no trial to force the full story into one ordered sequence. So the case began to move through a different pipeline, the pipeline of public records and document releases. On November 21st, 2018, the Weld County District Attorney's Office released more than 2,000 pages of investigative documents in response to a Colorado Criminal Justice Records request. Those pages did not feel like paperwork to most people. They felt like the missing middle of the story, the part where a family's private life is turned into a timeline that can be read, searched, and replayed. The release stitched together two realities that had been running at the same time. In one reality, Shanann was pregnant, raising two small children, trying to keep her marriage intact, and trying to understand why her husband had changed in a matter of weeks. The messages showed a woman reaching for closeness and getting distance in return. They showed her describing exhaustion, loneliness, and fear. They showed her pressing for a straight answer about whether he still wanted her, because uncertainty is often worse than truth. In the other reality, Chris was building a secret future while still living inside the old one. The record showed how quickly secrecy can become routine. It showed how lies do not always arrive as grand statements. They arrive as small omissions, delayed replies, deleted conversations, and a calm face that keeps moving through daily life as if nothing is wrong. The documents also made the early summer pregnancy announcement feel even more haunting in hindsight. The records included investigator summaries of videos and messages that captured the family's life as it was still moving forward. That contrast is why the case hits as hard as it does. It is not only that a crime occurred, it is that the crime occurred while ordinary life was still being filmed, texted, and posted like the future was guaranteed. This is where the archive changes the emotional temperature. A trial would have presented evidence through witnesses and procedure. The archive presented evidence through intimacy, through messages between spouses, through worries shared with friends, and through the raw, everyday texture of family life. It made the story feel closer, not because it added new horror, but because it showed how normal the outside looked, right up until the moment the truth became unavoidable. The release also poured fuel on the affair narrative because the documents contained law enforcement summaries connected to Nicole Kessinger's interviews and digital footprint. Investigators described how she framed the marriage as unhappy and the finances as stressful, and they documented how she spoke about the relationship's effect on the timeline. The archive also included investigators' notes about online searches found on her phone, including searches for Shanann Watts and searches about whether police can trace text messages after the murders. Those details did not replace the core facts of the case, but they expanded the context, and context is exactly what the public was hungry for once the plea ended any chance of courtroom revelation. That hunger created a predictable reaction. Some people treated the documents like a finished answer. Other people treated them like a starting point for suspicion, because when a case ends quickly, the public tends to assume something must be missing. Even when the legal outcome is permanent, and the defendant admitted guilt. The danger of an archive is that it invites both understanding and distortion at the same time. Understanding, because it shows how investigators work, how digital records collapse lies, and how timelines are built from verification rather than intuition. Distortion, because a document is not a life, and fragments can be rearranged into theories that feel persuasive while being unsupported by independent evidence. As demand kept coming, the Weld County District Attorney's Office eventually built a formal public page to streamline requests for Watt's case materials, which is one of the clearest signs that the case had transformed into a permanent public file. A local homicide became a global archive with a workflow attached to it. Then the archive expanded again in a way that revived the case worldwide. On March 7, 2019, the Colorado Bureau of Investigation released a redacted report and audio tied to the follow-up prison interview conducted on February 18, 2019. The timing mattered. The legal consequences were already fixed. There was nothing left to bargain for. That meant the interview was not about negotiating an outcome. It was about closing gaps, clarifying inconsistencies, and documenting a fuller account after sentencing. For the public, that release felt like a second ending. The first ending was the plea, the day the case ended in court. The second ending was the prison interview, the day the case regained momentum in the culture, because it provided new detail in a structured official format. This is how a solved case stays alive. A plea ends the courtroom narrative, but it does not end the public's need for sequence and meaning. The public then turns to the archive. The archive supplies new material. New material creates new arguments. New arguments create new attention. And attention creates a new wave of demand for the next file. In the Watts case, the loop became self-sustaining. The reason the loop survives is simple. The crime is so extreme that people keep searching for a motive large enough to match it. They keep searching for a hidden complexity that would make the horror feel less random and less possible inside an ordinary home. And when the archive provides only the blunt reality of selfishness, secrecy, and collapse of empathy, many people still refuse to accept that reality, because accepting it means accepting that a normal exterior can hide a total moral failure. So the archive does what it always does. It keeps the victims' lives visible, but it also keeps the killer's performance visible. And it keeps the public in a posture of analysis rather than closure. A judge can close a case. A sentence can be final, but an archive can make a tragedy renewable, because every new audience discovers the same materials as if they are new, and every discovery restarts the story again. And once a story restarts often enough, it stops feeling like a past event. It starts feeling like something that never ends.